Wow. I'm incredibly impressed. I was thinking, 4 p.m., the second day of the conference, there may be about 10 people in the audience. So this is really great. Wonderful to see. Well, I actually have a little bit of temporal dyslexia, I guess, to confess to in putting this talk together. I noticed in the program it said I was going to talk about what next, looking into the future, and I guess I ended up looking at the past instead. Unfortunately, and I probably didn't look at the program before I put this talk together, so I apologize for that. But I think it's actually more appropriate for me to look at the past. I think Dave and some folks are going to come up here as a panel and speculate and talk about what's coming next, and they're probably far more qualified than I. I'm probably qualified to talk about the past of OpenDaylight because I was there right at the start together with a few others. I think it's worthwhile, just to kind of look back a little bit, say what we promised ourselves when we started OpenDaylight, and then, what we've learned in the journey since then. And obviously, it's been an amazing journey, and I think, the evidence, of course, is in the release and the turnout of this summit. But it's, I think, worthwhile just taking stock a little bit and taking a one-year retrospective. And so that's what I plan to do. So OpenDaylight was conceived, right? There was probably some perhaps foreplay before that, but it was really conceived on February 4th, 2013, at the Citrix Auditorium. A bunch of us got together. I wonder how many of you were at the Citrix Auditorium on February 4th, 2013? Okay, well, actually, about maybe 10 folks from the audience. But that's so it was a group of about, I think it was about 70, 80 people, and it kept growing as the day went on. And we were really kicking around ideas. Hey, what is this thing going to be? What are we going to do? What kind of community are we going to create? There was a lot of different thoughts in terms of what this was going to be, the scope of the project. Was it a controller? Was it a platform? Who was going to be involved? Nobody had signed up at that point, right? So it was all kind of kicking around ideas and thoughts. So I put up a couple of slides, which and these are the exact slides that we looked at a year ago, and I thought it worthwhile just to look at those two slides and then perhaps compare ourselves against where we are with respect to those. So these were the goals that we set ourselves, right? We said to create a robust, extendable, open source code base, I think that's pretty much the goal right now. Getting acceptance, and then building community. So these were the three things that we set ourselves, and I think they were pretty accurate in terms of the importance, what's important in order to build something like this. We talked about the need to accelerate the adoption of SDN, and the fact, the driving motivator was that in many SDN instances, you had a single vendor, a monolith. And what we really wanted OpenDaylight to do was to be able to make this a true multi-vendor model where you could have a common code base in the middle. You could have vendors above, vendors below, vendors perhaps in the middle adding value to the OpenDaylight code base. So that was our conception, right? We wanted to get rid of vendor lock-in. We wanted to provide a mechanism for vendors to add value and deliver value faster. So benefiting both customers as well as vendors. So these are, as I said, exactly the slides that we showed a year ago. And I think they're pretty accurate in terms of setting the agenda and goals for what we want to do. So the other thing we said, right, was, and this was actually in April. So OpenDaylight was conceived on February 4th. It was actually born in, I think April 8th was the date, I forget, I think something like that. And then soon thereafter, we had ONS, and we gave a talk, essentially the coming out OpenDaylight at the Open Network Summit. And what we said at that time was, and there was all kinds of press about it. I mean, many of you have read, the press, and I think Jim Zemlin showed some of the excerpts, from various, trade press and other press, and there was, it was all of, there was some saying it was a positive thing. Most of them were just really wondering, what's the angle here? Why are people doing this? I mean, is there some, plot, to hijack the SDN world? I mean, it was all kinds of speculation. There was very little expectation that this would be an open, participatory community. And so what we said is, look, I mean, we can say all we want, and we sort of talked about what we were doing to put governance mechanisms in place and all of that. We said we can do everything, we can say what we want, but really what we need you to do is come back in 2 years and evaluate what we've done and judge us based upon that. So it's obviously not 2 years yet, it's just about a year. But I think it's worthwhile doing a little bit of a midterm self-exam and perhaps giving ourselves some grades based upon how we've accomplished the goals that we set ourselves, and also talking a little bit about some of the lessons. So that's really what I want to do for the rest of the talk. So what have we learned? So we learned that code contributions are important. I mean, I think we heard Neela say code is the coin of the realm, which of course it is. Our initial focus was, really on getting companies to contribute stuff. So when we were, recruiting companies to join OpenDaylight, it was real important for everyone coming in to, bring some code to the table, something that they'd already developed outside of the context of OpenDaylight. And pretty much every company, that joined into the platinum level with, not everyone, but most companies brought in, some substantial contribution, right? Something that they spent, millions of dollars developing, they brought it into open source, which, was in many cases a big leap of faith in terms of the success of this community. And so there was a big emphasis on that. There was a lot of jostling, as to which project gets accepted. What is the core controller going to look like? There were multiple parties, trying to get their code into different projects. And so there was a great deal of, pushing and pulling, and it took a lot of effort to keep the community together and to really start getting a level of trust, as we'll talk about. Our emphasis was really to get as many people to the party as possible. We wanted to get large participation. We wanted to get as many projects as possible, as many people as possible. And all this was very important to have a stable starting point. But I think very soon we realized that what was far more important, right, than having all of these code bases contributed, was really having a group of dedicated maintainers associated with those initial contributions. People who are willing not just to kind of put their code in there initially, but also work with the community, evolve that code base, and really become a part of the community together with that code contribution. So we've had contributions which essentially have pretty much been orphaned, right? They're sort of sitting there, without much interest and have not been part of the hydrogen release. But those projects that have been successful are projects where there has been initial contribution, but also has been significant ongoing involvement from the developers and maintainers. We've also learned that building community is hard, right? We spent a lot of time initially, putting in place openness, fair governance mechanisms. We thought a lot about this, right? So a lot of the early discussions were, discussing bylaws and discussing, hey, look, how does the board relate to the TSC? How do we make sure that technical decisions are made without interference from corporate, interests? So we put a lot of these things in place. We put in processes, right? And sometimes these processes were at the cost of decision-making speed, right? So you can't make rapid decisions if you have to go through a process and you have to get consensus. But we felt that was important. Dave Meyer made the decision very early on that every TSC meeting would be totally open, right? And of course, all of you probably aware of this. You can participate, you can contribute. There's really at the technical level in terms of decision making, it is a completely open book, right? And that was a very deliberate decision that we made, and it is sometimes at the cost of speed of action, right? You cannot operate as fast in such a community as you can if you're making arbitrary decisions. We also learned that perception is reality, right? I mean, you can put in all the governance mechanisms that you want. You can have everything on paper. You can actually have all the best intentions in the world. But there's a whole community outside, that's kind of looking at us and listening to what we're doing, and listening not participating necessarily, but just hearing about what we're doing, and making decisions about this project, right? Based upon what they're hearing, not necessarily what they're without direct involvement. And so just the perception, getting the right word out, making sure that it wasn't just that we were doing the right thing, but that people knew that we were doing the right thing, right? So there was a significant effort, spent in outreach, talking to the press, talking to other, outreach to other, groups, other bodies, standards bodies, and so forth, and really make people understand, what our goals were, what our objectives were, what our governance principles were. Despite all that, it took a long time for many folks to get used to working within an OSS community. There's many people, it's the first time they're working across company boundaries. There's a whole range of different comfort, experience levels, and it just took a while, to get us to operate with a culture of trust and inclusiveness, and that's something that we've probably still got some ways to go. We've come a long, long way, but I think we probably still have some ways to go. We also realized, and this is perhaps something that reflects on projects that haven't invested as much as we have in building a broad industry base. But building this industry base is critically important. An open source project isn't just saying, hey, look, I've got something, and I'm going to just put it out there and make it open source, and just somehow hope, that it will, create, form a community and, become something that, others adopt and build on. A community of one is not a community, and we've seen many, many instances in the SDN world, right, where vendors have made decisions, and put something into open source without necessarily the effort to really go and build a community and get broad industry participation. You need a body like this, a multi-organization body, right, that involves, large, small companies, individuals. You need something like this in order to create the community, right? A single company cannot do it. And I think OpenDaylight has done a great job here. And we're on a path to, really creating a true community. And we've got to guard this inclusiveness and diversity, very jealously. Another thing we learned is a platform is a lot more than a collection of components, right? So there was a lot of debate in OpenDaylight as to, hey, look, are we creating a toolkit, a framework, a bag of useful parts? Are we creating a fully integrated, pre-assembled offering that you can take out of the box and deliver value to a customer? Effectively a complete product or something very close to it. Obviously, these are two ends of the spectrum, right? And most projects in OpenDaylight started out as isolated little silos, right? So typically they did involve code that some vendor brought in. Other vendors, perhaps there were other participants from other companies in some cases, but most of these projects were built up as their own islands. And as we started putting them together, as we started creating the hydrogen release, we realized, right, and of course this is not no great surprise to anyone, but I guess it became apparent to everyone on the project as well, that integrating these islands is complicated, it takes a lot of time. You got to make technical decisions sometimes, in terms of how this integration takes place. Packaging, testing is a major project in its own right. And we've had members, in OpenDaylight, Ericsson in particular, that stepped up and, essentially took this on as a project, right? Which I think is an incredibly selfless thing to do. In some cases, it's not too hard to put things together. In some cases, it is very hard, right? So for example, in our virtualization release, we've got functionality that overlaps. So you cannot really have both functions operating together. You cannot have the VTN function and the OpenDAV function working at the same time. Now, these are things that will be solved as we go forward, but we've learned that creating a platform is really an effort in its own right. And one of the things that we're thinking through is really how much does OpenDaylight remain a bag of parts, and how much does it become a platform? And if it is a platform, is it one platform? Is it multiple platforms? So there is a lot of thinking that needs to be done in that area. We realized that there's got to be a balance between a grassroots project and a top-down project. Right? I mean, if typically in commercial software development, you do things on a top-down basis, right? You kind of have a set of requirements, you understand what you're trying to accomplish, you have a specification, you have a design, you have an overall architect, and you create the various components. The software team goes off, builds the components, you put them together, and you have your product offering. But there's a vision, there's some kind of unified concept that started the whole thing. With an open source project of this kind, you don't have that, right? So it's a far more amorphous entity. You want that because you want the creativity of the grassroots. You want people to have good ideas and be able to plug them into the project, right? But you also want to make sure, to the point before about this being a platform as opposed to a bag of parts, you want to make sure that there are no major technical gaps. This really is a platform. Right, so there are things like, the API governance, the data storage, and consistency, interoperability, performance scaling. These are kinds of issues where we continue to have gaps. Right, I mean, it is hard to take a lot of different projects, put them together, and expect that all of a sudden everything gets addressed. So these are things that we will continue to work on and fill in. And I think as you put things together, you realize what the gaps are, and then I think automatically the community starts working on filling the gaps. So the act of creating the platform addresses some of the gaps, but it doesn't result in it does take some time, right? And it does take some ongoing community involvement to fill. So I think again, there is I guess a debate as to how much of a top-down approach do we want to take in this, and how much of a bottoms-up approach? Should everything simply be bottoms-up? Should the TSC or the technical leaders in the community take more of a top-down role and identify areas that they really want addressed, and perhaps ask for volunteers to go fill those areas? Certainly, in the case of integration, that is what we did. Right? Nobody initially volunteered because it wasn't well understood that was a gap. But I think once we understood it, we asked for volunteers, and of course, people in the community stood up and said, "Yes, we will work on the integration project and deliver hydrogen." 47 seconds. Architectural consistency and evolution is obviously something that, again, this is for anyone who does software development, this is obvious, but as you get more users, as there's more dependence on the project, on what you're building, making changes gets harder, right? I mean, it's a good thing. It's a good thing because people are depending on you, and you start shifting the foundation, people get a little bit antsy. Right? We've had some examples of this even in the project to date, where we had to make some changes in some of the core controller architecture, and that had ripple effects right through the project, right? And we made those changes somewhat late in the game, and we would have been better if we had made them earlier. So I think we need to think through how we make architectural changes. Obviously, we will have to make architectural changes as we learn more about how customers are using OpenDaylight. We've got to think through this more. We've got to have a process of a plan, a process, and I think the TSC is going to have a real challenge to figure out how to do that. We've also got to be responsive to customers, right? I mean, I think to the point before, bottoms up or top down, right? I mean, you want what we build to be something that addresses customer needs, right? And grassroots, yes, to some extent, grassroots does reflect that, but it doesn't always reflect what customers want, right? I mean, sometimes it's what's interesting and what's cool to build and what's innovative and all of those things, but sometimes what you need is perhaps not, the most exciting thing in the world. You need some fairly basic function which is lacking, and customers are screaming for it. Someone's got to step up and do it, right? And so we'll get these kinds of things going forward, and I think we've got to have mechanisms and processes which balance innovation, grassroots involvement, and creating this platform. So, well, I've already said most of this. I mean, I think we came in thinking it's code. We realized it's community buy-in. This is the most important thing, and I think this is the greatest accomplishment of OpenDaylight. It's not the hydrogen code base, so that's important, but it is creating this community that's at least part of which is assembled in this room. And we've got to maintain that. We've got to maintain that and guard that jealously and make that something that prospers, is responsive to customers and commercial interest, but isn't necessarily subjugated by commercial interests. So I thought, hey, look, I mean, I've kind of seen this grow from gestation to now. So what are my thoughts in terms of grades, midterm grades? I said we'll really grade ourselves after 2 years. But midterm grades, I would say in terms of code, I would say an A-. We've got an amazing body of code in hydrogen. It's not integrated in the complete way that we would like it to be, but the team's done a pretty darn good job, and it's usable. It's I think a great base, right? So I would say an A-. Acceptance, I think we have some ways to go, right? I mean, I think most of you are probably from vendors. I mean, I know a few people from the user community as well, but I think we would judge the success of this project not based upon the fact that a bunch of vendors have come together, but really based upon the fact that there are a bunch of users, customers using the OpenDaylight for in real deployments, right? And I think that hasn't quite happened yet, but hey, we just released the product a couple of days ago. So I think in community we've done I think a really good job, right? I mean, I think I might even stretch that to an A, right? I think we've really tried very hard to foster the community. I think everyone on this project, every board member, every member of the TSC, every technical leader, every committer is really very much a part of the OpenDaylight community and wants to see this succeed and approaches it with the spirit of making this project a success. I mean, at the board, there really is no discussion about parochial company interests. I mean, it might be surprising when you say, well, you have got all these kind of big, giants represented at the board, but the board discussion is all about, hey, what makes sense for OpenDaylight? Not once do I recall any discussion where we say, oh, well, Cisco wants this, or, Microsoft wants this. I mean, it's really being, hey, look, what makes sense for OpenDaylight? So I think we've really come together, I think, very effectively. So anyway, I'm thrilled to see you all here, and I know the next panel is going to be incredibly exciting, so I don't want to delay it any longer. So thank you all very much. I think Dave and some folks are going to come up here as a panel and speculate and talk about what's coming next, and they're probably far more qualified than I. I'm probably qualified to talk about the past of OpenDaylight because I mean I was there right at the start together with a few others, and I think it's worthwhile just to kind of look back a little bit, say what we promised ourselves when we started OpenDaylight, and and then what we've learned in the journey since then. And obviously, it's been an amazing journey, and I think the evidence, of course, is in the release and the turnout of this summit. But it's, I think, worthwhile just taking stock a little bit, and taking a one-year retrospective. And so that's what I plan to do. So OpenDaylight was conceived, right? I mean, there was probably some. So I put up a couple of slides, which and these are the exact slides that we looked at a year ago. I thought it worthwhile just to look at those two slides and then perhaps compare ourselves against where we are with respect to those. So these were the goals that we set ourselves, right? We said to create a robust, extendable open source code base, I mean, I think that's pretty much the goal right now. Getting acceptance, and then building community. So these were the three things that we set ourselves, and I think they were pretty accurate in terms of the importance, what's important in order to build something like this. We talked about the need to accelerate the adoption of SDN, and the fact, the driving motivator was that in many SDN instances, you had a single vendor, a monolith. And what we really wanted OpenDaylight to do was to be able to make this a true multi-vendor model where you could have a common code base in the middle, you could have vendors above, vendors below, vendors perhaps in the middle adding value to the OpenDaylight code base. So that was our conception, right? We wanted to get rid of vendor lock-in, we wanted to provide a mechanism for vendors to add value and deliver value faster, so benefiting both customers as well as vendors. So these are, as I said, exactly the slides that we showed a year ago. And I think they're pretty accurate in terms of setting the agenda and goals for what we want to do. So the other thing we said, right, was, and this was actually in April. So OpenDaylight was conceived on February 4th. It was actually born in, I think April, perhaps foreplay before that, but it was really conceived on February 4th, 2013, at the Citrix Auditorium. A bunch of us got together. I wonder how many of you were at the Citrix Auditorium on February 4th, 2013? Okay, well, actually, about maybe 10 folks from the audience. But that's so it was a group of I think it was about 70, 80 people, and it kept growing as the day went on. And we were really kicking around ideas. Hey, what is this thing going to be? What are we going to do? What kind of community are we going to create? There was a lot of different thoughts in terms of what this was going to be, the scope of the project. Was it a controller? Was it a platform? Who was going to be involved? Nobody had signed up at that point, right? So it was all kind of kicking around ideas and thoughts. Wow, I'm incredibly impressed. I was thinking, 4 p.m. the second day of the conference, there may be maybe about 10 people in the audience. So this is really great, wonderful to see. Well, I actually have a little bit of temporal dyslexia, I guess, to confess to in putting this talk together. I noticed in the program it said I was going to talk about what next, looking into the future, and I guess I ended up looking at the past instead. Unfortunately, and I probably didn't look at the program before I put this talk together, so I apologize for that. But I think it's actually more appropriate for me to look at the past.